Hey everybody, making a video tonight on one of my favorite books here, if not my favorite book of all time, The Day After Roswell. I made an upload about another one of my favorite books the other night, The Gods of Eden, but tonight I thought it was time to talk about The Day After Roswell. Now, before I read this book, I had mixed feelings on Roswell. It sounded like a far-fetched story. It was pretty hard to believe, but there seemed to be a lot of evidence from people who were kind of saying the same story. So I really didn't know what to think. I was given a tip that this book was the book to read on Roswell, and I read it, and I found it to be an incredible book. It explained many things that I had questions about. It went into great detail. It was written by Philip Corso, who was actually given the different things from the wreckage of the craft to figure out what they are and to kind of slip them into some companies that were developing new projects. And at first, when I heard about the Roswell story, I thought that the back engineering of the things from the crash was one of the more unbelievable things of the whole story. But the way it was described and how they did it in this book, it became a totally feasible story to me. I don't believe in the story, I would say 100%, but I say I believe in it about 98% after reading this book. It was well written. Philip Corso kind of took some abuse for this book, but of course anybody that had the responsibility of alien wreckage was going to get discredited, and that is just part of the game there. And I'm sure he knew it was coming too. But you just have to read this book with some common sense, and you would find it very interesting if you did. And I want to spark your interest by just reading a little bit of the book. And this comes from a chapter called The Artifacts, and Philip Corso is writing this here, and a general has just left his office. He was just given the Roswell debris. This takes place some years after the actual crash, and the general wants Philip Corso to find out exactly what these individual things were from the crash and what they do. And he doesn't want them. He knows that people would kill for this debris. The Russians, the CIA, the different branches of the military, they would all die to get their hands on this, and he knew how important it was. He didn't want any part of it, but he was given the responsibility, and this is what he says. The general has just left his office and just given him the Roswell debris. And he was gone in a heartbeat, as if we'd never had the conversation. I didn't take the file apart that night. Even another nondescript wooden crate that looked something like you ship vegetables in was taken into my office by an equally nondescript army corporal. I didn't go through the material the next night either, but over the following week, whenever I could make sure that no one was around who could pop in without warning, I moved the material from the box into the file and allowed myself to look at it. It was just like falling through a looking glass into a different world, a puzzle of separate pieces that could only vaguely capture what I had read in memos over at the White House. No wonder no one really wanted anything to do with this junk, which held out the promise of a whole world we knew nothing about, but as far back as 1947, the government had decided to keep an absolute secret. Career after career of anyone in the government who even hinted at the big dark secret of Roswell was pulverized by whoever was behind this operation. And although I knew far more than I had even admitted to myself, I would never be the one to shoot off my mouth. But now this file, what I would eventually call the nut file to General Trudeau, had come into my possession, and as the ensuing weeks turned into a month, I gradually figured out where some of the puzzle pieces fit. It says, first, there were tiny, clear, single-filament, flexible, glass-like wires twisted together through a kind of gray harness, as if they were cables going into a junction. They were narrow filaments, thinner than copper wire. As I held the harness of strands up to the light from my desk, I could see an eerie glow coming through them as if they were conducting the faint light and breaking it up into different colors. When the personnel at the retrieval site, the desert outside of Roswell, pulled this piece of wreckage out of the delta-shaped object, they thought it was some sort of wiring device. A harness is what they said, or maybe some of them thought it was a junction box or electrical relay. But whatever they thought it was, they believed there was nothing like it on this planet. As I turned the object over in my hand, I figured from the way the individual filaments flexed back and forth but didn't break, and the way they were able to conduct a light beam along their length, they were a wire of some sort, but for what purpose, I didn't have a clue. And as you learn later in the book, this is exactly where we got fiber optics from. And I will read on here. Then there were the 2-inch around matte gray oyster-shaped wafers of a material that looked like plastic, but had tiny road maps of wires barely raised or etched along the surface. They were the size of a 25-cent piece, but the etchings on the surface reminded me of squashed insects with their hundreds of legs spread out at right angles from a flat body. Some were more rounded or elliptical. It was a circuit. Anyone could figure that out by 1961, especially when you put it under a magnifying glass, but from the way these wafers were stacked on each other, this was circuitry unlike any I'd ever seen. I couldn't figure out how to plug it in and what kind of circuit it carried, or what kind of current it carried, but it was clearly a wire circuitry of a sort that came from a larger board of wafers on board the flying craft. My hand shook ever so slightly as I held these pieces, not because they themselves were scary, but because I was awed, just for a few seconds, about the momentous nature of this find. It was like an architectural treasure trove, the discoveries of some long-departed culture, a Rosetta Stone, even though whoever crashed onto the desert floor was still active and roaming around our most secret Army and Air Force bases. I was most interested in the file descriptions accompanying a 2-piece set of dark elliptical eyepieces as thin as skin. The Walter Reed pathologist said they adhered to the lenses of the extraterrestrial creatures and seemed to reflect existing light, even in what looked like complete darkness, as to illuminate and intensify images in the darkness to allow their wearer to pick out shapes. The report said that the pathologist at Walter Reed Hospital who autopsied one of the creatures tried to peer through them in darkness to watch the 1 or 2 Army sentries and medical orderlies walking down a corridor adjacent to the pathology lab. These figures were illuminated in a greenish-orange depending upon how they moved, but the pathologist could only see their outer shape, and when they got close to each other, their shapes blended into a single form, but they could only see the outlines of furniture and the wall and objects on desktops. Maybe, I thought, as I read this report, soldiers could wear a visor that intensified images through reflection and amplification of available light and navigate in the darkness of a battlefield with as much confidence as if they were walking their sentry posts in broad daylight. But these eyepieces didn't turn night into day. They only highlighted the exterior shapes of things. There was a dull, grayish, silvery foil-like swatch of cloth among these artifacts that you could not fold, bend, tear, or wad up, but that bounded right back to its original shape without any creases. It was a metallic fiber with physical characteristics that would later be called super-tenacity. But when I tried to cut it with scissors, the arms just slid right off without even making a nick in the fibers. If you tried to stretch it, it bounced right back. I noticed that all the threads seemed to be going in one direction. When I tried to stretch it widthwise instead of lengthwise, it looked like the fibers had reoriented themselves to the direction I was pulling. This couldn't be cloth, but it obviously wasn't metal. It was a combination, to my unscientific eye, of a cloth woven with metal strands that had the drape and malleability of a fabric. I'm sorry here, I'm getting tired reading this. Of fabric and even the strength and resistance of a metal. I was on top of some of the most secret weapons projects at the Pentagon, and we had nothing like this, even under the wish list category. And what he is describing right there would later be developed into Kevlar vests, bulletproof vests, stuff like that. It says, there was a written description and a sketch of a device too, like a short, stubby flashlight, almost with a self-contained power source that was nothing at all like a battery. The scientists at Wright Field who examined it said they couldn't see the beam of light shoot out of it, but when they pointed the pencil-like flashlight at a wall, They could see a tiny circle of red light, but there was no actual beam from the end of what seemed like a lens to the wall, as there would have been if you were playing a flashlight off a distant object. When they passed an object in front of the source of light, it interrupted it, but the beam was so intense the object began smoking. They played with this device a lot before they realized it was an alien cutting device like a blowtorch. Once they floated some smoke across the light, and suddenly the whole beam took shape. What had been invisible suddenly had a round, micro-thin, tunnel-like shape to it. Why did the inhabitants of this craft have a cutting device aboard their ship? It wasn't until later, when I read military reports of cattle mutilations in which entire organs were removed without any visible trauma to the surrounding cell tissue, that I realized that the light beam cutting torch I thought was in the Roswell file was actually a surgical implement, just like a scalpel that was being used by the aliens in medical experiments on livestock. Then there was the strangest device of all, a headband, almost with the electrical signal pickup devices on either side. I could figure out no use for this thing whatsoever, unless whoever used it did it as so to fancy. Let me read that again. Unless whoever used it did so as a fancy hairband. It seemed to be one-size-fits-all headpiece that did nothing, or at least for humans. Maybe it picked up brainwaves like an electroencephalogram and projected a chart, but no private experiment conducted on it seemed to do anything at all. The scientists didn't even determine how to plug it in or what its source of power was, because it came with no batteries or diagrams. And later, that thing they figured out was a headband that these aliens wore, and that's how they controlled the ship, was through their thoughts and their mind and thought projection. You just got to read that for yourself in the book. I know it sounds far-fetched. It even sounds far-fetched when I say it, but after reading this book, you might think twice. Once again, that's the day after Roswell. Just thought I'd share a little bit of it. Sorry, I had a little difficult reading there, but I'm a little tired, and sometimes I don't do it so well. But anyway, hope you thought that was interesting. Have a nice night.